as I've been doing these interviews, I've had the chance to talk to some amazing people, and a handful of times I've been as excited as I am to talk to my guest today. I would like to welcome to the show the host of the amazing Where There's Smoke podcast, Mr. Brett Gajda. How are you doing today, Brett?
I am doing fantastic, Mike, and thank you for that introduction. I'm pretty excited myself. I mentioned to you before we started recording. This is my first video interview. So a lot of people might just be listening to this on audio, but we're also recording it on video. So yeah, this is a first for me too. So I'm excited.
Awesome. And you have I mean, you've been at this for a while. You've had business success. Have done a lot of coaching. You've made other attempts at getting content out there. Where There's Fire is really kind of catching on. How's everything going in your business life in general for you?
Things are amazing, and I will say you're right that I've been doing this for a while, and I consider myself. I'm always learning. Where I always like to say that we're constantly teachers and students at the same time in our lives, and it just kind of depends on the moment and who we're talking to. But I was actually thinking about this just the other day because we launched Where There's Smoke. Literally 3 weeks ago, I think. It just got out there, and the response has been amazing. And we're getting a lot of feedback from people that are just saying, "Oh my God, it sounds so great, and the content's great, and the production and the idea." And I think, as you'll often hear people say, right, about things overnight success or these things that happen. I really was thinking the other day about what a journey this has been for me. First of all, I've been interested in self-development probably my whole life, but professionally, I've been speaking, teaching, coaching, training for over 10 years. And so, this is really the culmination of my life and who I am. And as I said to you before we started recording, I feel like this is the full expression of me. And so I'm 43 years old, and I would say that 43 years of life is being expressed in the podcast. So yeah, it's definitely been as everyone's life has, it's been a journey. And I think it's cool for me to think about this podcast as really being an expression that is reflecting that whole journey for me.
I love this idea of full expression. I mean, that's where success lies, right? When we can be our true authentic selves and be embraced by the world. And that's kind of the goal, right?
I think so. And again, everyone, I'm not saying that is. For those of you who might have heard the podcast, or maybe we'll go listen to it. In episode 4, I tackled the meaning of life, which seemed like a pretty big thing to tackle in episode 4. But I think ultimately the meaning of life is going to be unique to all, whatever it is these days, 6.8 billion people you talk to. So everyone's going to have their own belief. For me, that's always been a big thing, is this idea of living your full expression. And it's what I find a lot of people do want. And one of the things I've worked at over the years is not judging what other people's full expression is. So if your ideal life is you want to sit on the couch and binge watch Breaking Bad 8 hours a day, then I say let's go create a lifestyle. Let's go create a business. Let's go create whatever where you can sit on the couch and watch Breaking Bad 8 hours a day, right? I'm not here to tell you you should do this or that. And so I just think that's a really cool thing that that we can live. Well, not even live the life. It's more that we can be the person we want to be, because I think that's, a lot of people say they want freedom. And I heard an interesting concept a few years ago where people often talk about time freedom, money freedom, and, having the time and the money freedom, right? And a couple years ago, I heard someone talking, and they were talking about 4 freedoms: time freedom, money freedom, geographic freedom, which I'm a big believer in because I've worked my whole life to have businesses I can operate from anywhere. And the fourth one, which I thought was really cool, was emotional freedom, right? Meaning that you just, you know, you get to feel what you feel. Maybe you're not, we've all had traumas in our life, and maybe there's not something that's weighing over you. And so I think, when people talk about, I want to be free, I think emotional freedom is a big part of it. And that's where that link to full expression is for me, is if you can be expressing yourself the way you want to express yourself, you probably feel pretty free every day, regardless of what your, financial situation is, or your geographic situation, or your time situation, I would think.
And so what ties that all together is, I think, still this idea of fully expressing yourself,
Yeah.
feeling successful, feeling happy and fulfilled, getting out of life what you want. What do you see as kind of the components of that? I mean, so one struggle that I've had in the past is even just knowing what I want. So what am I worrying? What adds up to this fulfillment?
Yeah.
How do you
Well,
build that
I
from the
have
ground?
there's there's a lot of things that I say that I know I borrowed from somewhere else, and things I quote, and I try to remember where I'm quoting them from. But I have a couple of Brett-isms, as I like to call them. And one Brett-ism is I often say that purpose is not something you decide; it's something you discover. And that comes from this idea of working with people in personal development and leadership for 10 years and seeing people who their greatest struggle was, I just don't know what I want to do, or I don't know what my purpose is. As soon as I figure it out, I'm going to move. And they're literally in paralysis by analysis because they're trying to figure out what their purpose is. And as soon as they do, they're going to move. And they can blink and 20 years can pass and they've been in this hell called indecision. And so the reason I say that is, look, purpose is usually something you discover, not decide. So you got to just move, because the reality is to figure out what you don't want to do is can actually be as valuable as figuring out what you do want to do. And so just go do something, just move towards, I said in that Meaning of Life podcast that Tony Robbins always says happiness is progress. And that literally is one of my mantras. I've always repeated that. And I just think if I can just move an inch today, an inch closer to what I think I want, then I'm getting there. And even if that inch means that by what I did is I moved towards something and realized, ooh, I don't want to do that, that's still progress. So I think, one of the things that I always say as far as what are the keys, one of the keys is you just got to get into some sort of action, some sort of movement. And just, if you can just find one little thing, you're like, well, maybe it's that. Okay, great. Move towards it and see what happens.
So that, I mean, sounds very flexible. It sounds very forgiving. You just, get out there and try something. And if you like it, keep going. And if you don't, try something else. But people still run into trouble. Like
Oh, of course.
where, why is it, if you have this much freedom, just, if all you have to do is get out there and try something, then why do people still run into so much trouble?
Well, I think there's different conversations, right? The one conversation is this idea of what do I want to do with my life, or what's my purpose or what makes me happy. And with that conversation, I think that's where I go back to this idea of, well, just do something and see what happens. There's another conversation about what people deem as success, right? And everyone, again, has a different definition of success. For some people, it's largely due to finances, or it's time freedom, or it's emotional freedom, or it's where I live, or it's how I live, or what I do, or the difference I make, or how many people like me, or whatever it is. I think that's a different conversation, because success is, no matter what, not going to happen overnight. And it's interesting. Like, I mean, you have a lot of these conversations. I'm sure you see this. I've started several businesses in my lifetime, and often in my history, I've seen people and I hear them tell their story. And when I hear their story, it's almost like, God, it was so much easier for them than it's been for me. And then when I actually get those people alone in a room and I talk to them, they're always shocked by that. They're like, "Oh my God, is that what came across in my story? I didn't mean to express that. Oh no, it was crazy." And then they tell me all the nuts and bolts. But it's easy to see people who are maybe closer to where we are than, closer to where we want to be than we are, and think, God, I bet it was easier for them. And of course, every journey is different. But all in all, when I talk to people out there and I look at my own life, I think it's not. It's not, man. I just said this to my friend yesterday. Like, oftentimes, the difference between, oh my God, everything's going great, and oh my God, everything's falling apart it's like this. It's like an inch. I mean, I don't know. We want to get into this story already, but we talked about where there's smoke, and I mentioned to you before we started recording that I've really been struggling for the last 2 years trying to figure out how to get my voice out. And one of the stories we're actually going to tell in this week's episode, and I don't know when this interview is going to air, but in episode 6 of Where There's Smoke, we're going to tell a little bit of the story of this podcast. And I'm sitting here talking to you on February 13th. Our podcast launched on January 27th. On November 14th of last year, my partner, Nick Jaworski, who edits the show, produces the show, and is, the reason the show sounds so amazing. November 14th of last year, I didn't know Nick. I'd never heard his name. We'd never met, and we had no mutual friends. And I was sitting in my house in San Francisco going, I think I want to do this podcast. And I put an ad up on Elance and tried to find somebody. And I thought, I'm living in a fantasy world, because I'm looking for someone who loves Radiolab, who loves This American Life, who understands self-development. And frankly, I have no money right now I'm married. I got a 3-year-old kid. I'm the sole provider. I do all right, but I live in San Francisco where $100,000 is the poverty line. So, for me, it was like, I can't afford to do what I want to do, which would basically be a show that would probably cost me $500 an episode to produce. How's this going to happen? And yet, 2 months later, we're launching the show and we're partners. And I mean, I was as close to I give up as I was to, oh my God, this is working. And the difference between those two things, I think, is just the result of any decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And as you were talking through that, I think what I could really hear that was that if I'm in pain right now, it's really hard for me to hear and understand somebody else's pain. So
Mm.
I want to be successful in my business. I want things to go well. I feel like they're not. So I'm frustrated. And all I can hear in my life is that frustration, which is kind of what keeps me there, right? Because that's
Yeah.
what I'm circling in and dwelling on and thinking about all the time. So I just get more and more of it. But that's really why I want to do these interviews, is because I really want people to hear that, yeah, it sucks where you are right now. Maybe you don't know what to do. But a lot of people have felt that way, and a lot of people have gone on to be very happy and successful and fulfilled with the projects in their lives. And a lot of what we do is on that line of, am I going to give up or am I going to keep going? And that ends up being what makes the difference a lot of times, I think.
Yeah. And what's great about human beings, at least most of them that I've met, including myself, is we have really selective memory. If you ask me about my life, I'll be like, God, so many times I was so close to failing and I succeeded, or, all in all, I've been pretty lucky. But the reality is I have failed way more times than I've succeeded. I just conveniently forget those. Like I always say, and I think a lot of people are like this. I have a very optimistic memory. you know, and have you ever noticed this? I mean, if you've gone through hard times, I know sometimes you'll talk about traumas, and you know, I mean, my father died when I was 18. I've had relationships break up. I've lost everything. When you're in those moments, it can feel like, oh my God, I'm not going to survive. But once you do survive and you look back, those moments don't seem like they were as bad as when you were in them. And I don't know which is true. I don't know if they were actually that bad and I don't remember them as being that bad, or if maybe they really weren't that bad. They just felt that bad because I was in them.
Well, so that I think kind of goes to the core premise of this show, which is that emotional health is critically important. It's our most fundamental, foundational entrepreneurial skill. And I think what you're speaking
Yeah.
to, I hear that as kind of emotional health. Being emotionally healthy doesn't mean that you're happy and just blissful all the time, but it means that you know how to deal with those setbacks and you know how to use anger as a tool and feel pain and process through the grief and then bounce back and get back out there and do what you need to do.
Yeah, and that's a big thing. And again, I'm not trying to self promote the show, but we just talked about this, so it's so interesting. Episode 4, we're talking about the meaning of life and happiness. I had an amazing guest, Laura Delazana, who's actually a good friend of mine, positive psychologist, and we talked about that. How happiness is not about, oh my God, everything's great, that's not what happiness. Happiness is like the sum of everything. Right, a lot of Buddhist teachings talk about this idea that love is the sum of everything, right? It's even that's why the yin yang symbol exists. So people think, well, there's love and there's hate, or there's happy and there's sad. But then in actuality, love encompasses everything. And happiness encompasses everything. So happiness is actually about, oh my gosh, like I just had the worst thing ever happen to me today. And I'm going to be okay. There's someone I really, really love, a woman named Pima Chodron, who's a Buddhist monk, and she's written some great books. If anyone out there is struggling, um, there is a book. Start from I believe it's called Start from Where You Are. Pima Chodron, which is one of my all. I mean, the amount of I've probably bought that book more than any other book for other people when they're struggling. And this is a Buddhist concept, but I always remember her talking about, which is, everything can be going horrible. So it can be like, oh my gosh, I just lost my job. I'm out of money. I just went bankrupt. I tweaked my back. I can barely move, and it's okay. Right? Like at the end of it, there's always that it's okay. And I'm going to sit in it and I'm going to be in it, because the only way to, as they say, the only way through it is through it, right? And so I think that's a big thing. And that really, if you want to get into science or want to get into more kind of business speak, that's emotional intelligence, right? Emotional intelligence is the ability to actually control and deal with emotions as they happen. And so, yeah, I think that's a big piece of it. And that's something I can look back, on my life, and I can notice the difference between, let's say, how I dealt with my father's death at 18 compared to how I dealt with something that was tragic at 30 compared to how I dealt with something, right? Because I think hopefully, ideally, we continue to work on ourselves, we get better at that. And in the moment, when it all feels like it's falling apart, we have the perspective to step out and go, wait a second, this is going to be okay. But
I,
that only comes with training, really, training ourselves.
which ideally, that's the kind of training we receive from our parents growing up, right? I,
Yeah, well, ideally, that would be the kind of training we'd receive in school, but that's a whole other can of worms we'd open
Sure.
up.
But that's our challenge. I mean, we learn how to deal with life as we grow up. And if we don't learn effective, correct coping techniques and mechanisms, how to use our emotions, how to feel comfortable and safe, then we kind of run into these problems. And I think that's kind of the core injury of emotional traumas, is that if we don't heal from that, it teaches us to misinterpret or mistrust what we're feeling to a certain extent. So we'll see that other people appear to have happiness and success and feel like, well, I can't have that because my life is different. But these are the core tools that we all have. It's just a matter of using them effectively. You referenced how you dealt with it when your father passed as kind of a counterexample to how you deal with things now. Is that
Yeah.
what was behind that?
Well, I mean, when you first reached out to me and you said, my show's a lot about people dealing with trauma and coming out of that. And, the first thing that came to mind was my father's death, because my father's death is not only the most traumatic experience that's ever happened to me, it in many ways has dictated everything that's happened to me since, including what I do for a living today. Because I do not believe that I would be, well, first of all, I don't believe I'd be living in San Francisco. I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada. I don't believe I would ever moved here. I don't believe I would have ever, taken the self development journey I took, because a lot of the reason I took that journey was because I was 30 years old, and he had been dead for 12 years and I was still struggling with it. Um, so it dictated so much, and then to the point where, I mean, if you want to get really spiritual about it, and those who know me know I'm not like I'm a spiritual person, but I don't talk about spirituality a lot. But I feel like my dad's with me, and in a lot of ways, I feel like the journey I'm on now and the work that I do now is actually completing work that he started. And so I just so it dictates a lot. But when I look back when I was 8, I mean, oh man, I mean, when my father died, I was just a wreck. And at first, I thought that my mom was a wreck, my brother was a wreck. So I thought, well, I'll be the stoic, strong one. So I kind of tried to hold it together. And that just resulted in me basically delaying the inevitable. So I feel like while everybody else mourned my father's death right after it happened, I didn't really mourn his death until 2 years after it happened. Um, and then it was just all this crazy pressure. I wrote a piece that's actually posted on Medium, um, about this when I launched my blog last year. I wrote this piece about why I do what I do, and a lot of it talks about my dad and it tells some of this story. But I was 18 years old and my dad was my hero, and I felt like I had this moment where I thought, oh my God, it's up to me now because he's gone. And I don't know what to do with that. And the kind of quirky story I tell, but I swear this actually happened, was I had this vision. I don't know if any of your listeners remember this or you remember this, but way back in the 80s, I think it was, there was a TV show called The Greatest American Hero. And on The Greatest American Hero, the plot was that this guy on Earth finds this superhero suit that aliens left. And the superhero suit has all these powers, but he doesn't know how it works. So he puts this suit on and he has all these powers, but he'll like end up flying through brick walls because he doesn't know how to work it. So it's like he has all the power in the world, but he has no instruction manual. And that's how I felt. I felt like my dad gave me the superhero suit. He raised me to be 18, but we never got to have the conversations of what does it mean to be a man. And I just didn't know how to do it. And I wanted to do it so bad because my dad was my hero and I felt like he didn't have an enemy in the world, which again was not true, but that was my perception. And I wanted to be a good man. And I just thought, well, how the hell, who's going to show me now? And so I struggled for a long time. And while I was struggling, I put all this pressure on myself because I had put my father on this pedestal and I was trying to be as great as him. And it literally wasn't until I took a personal development course when I was 30 years old that I had this vision with my dad talking to me, laughing at me, going, dude, like, what do you, I was not perfect. Like, I was flawed. Get me off the pedestal. Like, just do your best. And as silly as that might sound, that was like a weight off my shoulders because I was like, I was trying to be Superman instead of just being a guy, you know? So that event has dictated so much of my life and I was really whacked out. I mean, you know, I hurt my current girlfriend at the time. I mean, God bless her, what she went through with me and my emotional traumatic state. So when I look at how, you know, stuff that's happened to me in my 30s, let's say, and I think, okay, well, how did I deal with that compared to how I dealt with something when I was 18 or 20? I mean, obviously it's, or hopefully I guess you would say it's very different. And but again, we learn, right? We go through these events, and hopefully, as we figure out our way through them, we it's so that we're not going to make the same mistakes again, or maybe only make them a couple more times.
So if you look back to like your late 20s, you're still kind of struggling with this. Did you
Yeah.
recognize that that was what was
No.
kind of in the way? Like what did that feel like? You're able to look
No.
back and now and see that, but what did that feel like at
Yeah,
the
and I
time?
realized actually, even as I said it, I kind of misrepresented it because it wasn't like I turned 30 and I was like, "Oh my God, I'm still dealing with my dad's death. I better get sorted out." I turned 30. Uh, at that point in time, a friend of mine, approached me and asked me about taking this personal development class, and I thought, well, I don't need a personal development class. I'm doing great. You know, I had my own business in San Francisco. You know, we had built a from zero to $5 million. I was making significant six figures. I had just taken a year off and traveled around the world. I was like living the dream. And so I'm like, I'm fine. You know, I'm great. And she said, it was pretty funny actually, because she knew me really, really well. So she kind of tapped in and she said something along the lines of, Brett, I think you're really great. You're this, you're that, you're this, you're that. And I just think this class would help you be even more of who you already are. And I remember in my head, I was like, ooh, more Brett? That sounds good. Yeah, yeah. Like, you know, and afterwards, she confessed to me that she felt like there was emotional things I needed to work through, but she knew that wouldn't work. So she was like, oh, you're awesome. And this class will make you more awesome. And I was like, oh, I'm in. Where do I sign? Right. And it was only when first of all, I had that experience in that class. And that was where I had that moment, you know, with my dad and laughing at me and going, take me off the pedestal. That was when I really realized how much it had been affecting me. And I also realized how much turning 30 had affected me because I thought it was no big deal. But I realized it had because suddenly something had clicked in my brain of like, well, okay, Brett, the playtime's over, right? You know, like your 20s are done. It's time to maybe figure out what you're gonna do. You know, even though again I was running a business, I was doing all this stuff, but I didn't feel like I was living my purpose. I felt like through a couple of a couple of interesting risks and a couple of interesting coincidences, I fell into an opportunity in San Francisco during the dot-com boom and managed to make the most of it, and we did really well. But it wasn't my purpose. It was I always thought I'll do this for a few years, I'll make some money, and then I'll get out. So it was still that idea of, well, what the heck am I doing with my life? You know, what's the legacy I'm going to leave? And I didn't know what that was.
That is such a perfect story. And I'm just blown away every time I hear a story like that. And it happens over and over and over again where somebody will talk through, I knew that I had this in my past. I lived a huge section of my life getting, sometimes good results, but I wasn't fulfilled by it. I wasn't energized by it. I didn't feel like I was living my purpose. And then as I was able to build some awareness around that and heal it, now I feel like I'm living my true, happy, successful, fulfilled life. And it happens over and over and over
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
what, so do you have a sense of like, kind of like, what are the core things that you learned that you'd been like, was it like you learned something that you were thinking incorrectly, or a belief that you had that wasn't serving? Like what was the gap between going into
Well,
this experience and
yeah.
coming out of
I
it?
mean, I can tell you one big thing, which was the fact that I was afraid, and I don't know how it links necessarily, but I realized that there were things I knew I wanted to do, and I was afraid to do them. So the very first thing, I took this class when I was 30, and the very first thing I did when I got out, I mean, ultimately took me 6 months to get this done, but the very first goal I set and I set out to do was to record an album. I mean, I still am, I guess, a musician, but back then I was much more of a practicing musician. I was in a band when I was in Toronto. I moved to San Francisco. I always wanted to make an album, and I thought to myself, God, I'm a good songwriter. If I made an album, it would be really great. But I realized that what I was doing was I had convinced myself in my brain that the album I would make would be great. And so I was living off of the confidence of the belief that the album would be great. And what I didn't want to do was actually create the album, because if the album wasn't as good as what I had imagined, then I have to deal with that reality. Right. And again, I didn't realize any of this consciously back then. It was only afterwards I realized that I was just scared out of my mind to go back to the initial thing we talked about. I was scared out of my mind to fully express myself, because what if people rejected me? What if I made this album and people were like, oh my God, that's crap? Or what are you singing about? Or why are you talking about that? Then I'd have to live with that. But if I never made the album and I just convinced myself that it was going to be great, I could just live off that false confidence, I'll call it, because it was false confidence that it was going to be great. So as soon as I got out of this class, that was and again, that somehow links to my dad. I don't really know if I can totally link it, but I mean, it definitely had linkages to just all this emotional stuff and rejection and all kinds of things. And so I come out, I make the record, and it ends up being something I'm very, very proud of. And actually, funny enough, just yesterday, my buddy sent me a screenshot. My record's on Spotify. I didn't even know it was on Spotify. And he's like, I'm listening to you right now. And I mean, the record is 12 years old. I was like, oh, wow, throwback Thursday. Perfect, right? But I'm very proud of that record. And putting it out there was a huge risk for me. And playing in front of people with just me and a guitar was crazy, very vulnerable. But then that dictated everything else, because then when I decided I wanted to get into personal development and facilitate classes and help people, again, talk about being vulnerable, in front of a room. And then even if I fast forward and I look at this podcast, the struggle with this podcast was never, I'm afraid to put it out. It was more about figuring out the medium and how am I going to do it and can I afford to do it but that fear of putting something out and having people reject it, I don't have that fear. I mean, I shouldn't say I don't have it anymore. I think it's still there a little bit, but it's easier to bust through because I have an experience of busting through it and it came out okay. And and there were people who hated my album and that was okay too. Right. So I think that was a big thing, was realizing that part of the reason I wasn't living my purpose was because I was holding on to what I had, and I was afraid to actually step out of that and go after what I wanted. And once I did that once, it became easier to do it again and do it again and do it again. And if I look at the last, 13 years of my life, there is a series of me stepping into things where have no idea what I'm doing. I mean, I started a business 7 years ago where it was like I was a PhD, and all of a sudden I was back in kindergarten, and I was just like, oh my, and that's really scary, right? I think that's another point, I think, to a reference for people, is that as we grow and we get great at things, I think we're a lot more afraid to go back and be a beginner again. Because if I'm let's take what in our world, there's a lot of people in the world of podcasting and they're entrepreneurial. Maybe they have a job and they want to start their own business. And it's like, if, some guy works for Microsoft and he's a manager and he's really good at what he does and everyone treats him like he's really, really great, and he decides he's going to go start a podcast, well, he's putting himself at risk of now he's the bottom of the barrel, right? And it's actually, if you've ever heard this, it's a great, great video if you look it up. This Ira Glass concept, where he talks about, if you don't know who Ira Glass is, right? Ira Glass is This American Life. And he talks about this gap between, people go and they start something. So you go and you say, I want to do a podcast. Now you have really, really good taste. So you know what's good, but you've never done a podcast before. So odds are when you start your podcast, it's not going to be as good as your taste. And so you're creating something that to exaggerate, that is crap.
You're pretty disappointed.
But the only way to make it great, is to keep doing it.
Yeah.
And so what happens for a lot of people is they don't want to have that experience. They don't want to have that experience of being a beginner or having not be as, so they go, well, I'm just going to stay here because right here I'm good and people respect me and people look up to me. And if I go over there, I have to, it's like I got to go back to the mailroom and I don't want to do that. And I understand that feeling because it's scary.
Yeah.
But man, it's the only way to make change.
You, you covered a lot of ground
I know I
there.
did. I know I can go off.
So many great points, though. I mean, the stepping into fear, I think, huge emotional health issue. You hear business owners all the time talk about, success in business comes when you're able to step into the difficult things. And again, I think one of the key damages done injuries of emotional trauma are if you don't trust yourself, you don't know that you're going to be okay. So you almost can't step into that fear because you don't have that belief that, hey, it feels hard, but it is going to work out. And I mean, the whole story you told, I think the way you stepped through it, I'm sure so many people can associate with that at lots of different points. So what now? I mean, is there anything that you think you could have gone back to yourself at 28 or 29 to say that would get through? Like, what would you have wanted to hear then, or do you just think that's the process you had to go through?
Well, I do think that's the process I had to go through. So for sure. But I'll tell you a story that has been really helpful to me and has been really helpful to a lot of people I've coached over the years. And it links to this idea. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that I heard this story in a class years ago. I've now done the research on this story, and I can tell you that it's a little more fact or a little more fiction than fact as far as the actual, but the story goes, it talks about this idea of when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier. Okay. And again, just for everyone out there, there's a little bit of dramatic license in this story. Okay. But there is a truth to the fact that when we were trying to break the sound barrier, other guys were going up in these planes and they were trying to break the sound barrier. Now, here's how the story was told to me. And this is where there's some story and not fact. Okay. But that a couple of other pilots had gone up to break the sound barrier. Okay. And when just before you in the plane, just before you get to the sound barrier, everything really starts shaking violently. Now that part's true. Everything does start shaking violently. And what happened with these other pilots is as everything was shaking violently, they freaked out because they're like, "Oh my God, it's too fast." So they pulled back on the throttle. But as soon as they pulled back on the throttle, the plane exploded. Okay? Because it was like it was shaking and then they pulled back and so now you have Chuck Yeager who goes up there, right? And a couple people have failed, and he goes up there and he gets in this plane and he goes and he gets to that point and he hits it. Everything's shaking violently, and his instinct, his total instinct, is to pull back on the throttle, right? Because it's like, oh my God, I'm about to drive over the cliff. I got to pull back on the throttle. But he remembers what happened to the other two pilots, and he goes, you know what? Screw it. I might as well. I mean, if I pull back on the throttle, it's going to explode. So I might as well just jack it forward and go for it. So he pushes it forward, and all of a sudden, everything goes silent. And he like breaks the sound barrier. Now, again, if you know the real story, that's not actually what happened. There are some little tidbits in there. But the point of the story is a phrase that's used very often by people, which is this idea of breakdown before breakthrough, right? That breakdown comes just before breakthrough. And just when it feels, and actually you can see this in nature, there's something called um, oh my God, I forget the name of it now, but it's a concept in nature of how things evolve in nature, that they get to their breaking point before they evolve, so that way when they do evolve, they're even stronger. And so this idea that just when it feels like everything's going to fall apart, that's actually just before everything's going to come together. And there's so many stories like this. If you've ever read Napoleon Hill, what is it called? Like 3 feet from gold. Same idea, right? You're digging, and just you think you're not there, so you quit. And it turns out if you had dug for another hour, you would have hit it. It's all the same idea. But that Chuck Yeager story, I wish it was true because it's a great story, but I still love it. That Chuck Yeager story has helped me because now go back to emotional, which you talked about earlier, your emotional state. When everything's shaking and everything's falling apart, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm about to lose it, I actually start to get excited because I'm like, oh my God, I'm close. I'm about to break through. I'm about to break through. And now I've got this belief, whether it's true or false, I've got this belief that most of the times when I make a big breakthrough, it's only going to come after a breakdown. So when things start to break down, instead of me going to, oh, this is it, it's not going to work, I go to, oh my God, we're so close. And I have to say, like, that mentality has been so huge for me, because I mean, last year, man, I was there. I mean, I was there. I had so much stuff go down last year. You know, we lost $1 million client that cost me personally about $50,000. I had some emotional stuff going on in my life. I was struggling with the Raise Your Value site that I had previously launched and didn't really feel like it was my full expression, but I wanted to make a difference. I was just struggling, and I just felt like every time I thought that nothing else could happen, something else happened. I mean, August of last year, it was like it had been raining for 5 months, and then it started pouring, and then the lightning came, and I just thought, oh my God, like I don't know how I'm going to get through this. And then I remember having that thought of like, oh, it's coming. The breakthrough's coming, right? You know, and the breakthrough came in November, and I don't know if I would have been around for the breakthrough if I didn't have that belief, which I've carried with me for years.
Yeah, that's a really cool. I mean, it's a very powerful story, and I've totally experienced that in my own life. This idea of breakthroughs coming after breakdowns, and it also really kind of reinforces uh, the how it's a process and how each step builds on the next. If you hadn't gone through the emotional healing, you wouldn't have had the strength to go through these tough times now and persevere because you might have just quit. So yeah, things
Right.
maybe never got that bad, but you also didn't make the progress. So it's easy to think like, why is this happening to me? But it's building up your strength for the next hard thing that you need to face, which is going to pave the way to your success and what you want to get out of life. I love it.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. I mean, just had someone ask me. I was having a conversation with a friend a couple days ago, and we were talking about the podcast, and I was saying, "God, it's going really, really great." And then she brought up last year because she'd been through it, and I just said, "Of course, now that everything's going well, I look at last year and I think, well, I wouldn't change any of it because I know that if I change any of it, I might not be here." And how many times have I had that feeling? Have you had that feeling? Have people out there had that feeling, right? And so this other kind of phrase that I always love, which I had a coach say to me years ago, which was, that idea that we're going to laugh about this someday, right? Like we're going to laugh. And I remember her saying, well, if you're going to laugh about it someday, why don't you just save yourself 6 months of heartache and laugh about it now? And that's another thing, like, not that it's that easy. Okay. It's not that easy, but I at least say that to myself sometimes when I'm really in it. I'm like, okay, Brett, you're going to laugh about this someday. So maybe you should just laugh about it right now, you know? And it just, if nothing else, it at least snaps me out of my state for 5 seconds, which can sometimes at least be enough.
Yeah, I hear you. So where now do you start? So somebody comes to you and they want to do this album, but they're afraid it's not going to be as good as they want it to be, and so they're never getting started with it. What does the coach say now?
Um, I would say that, and again, I mean, I don't consider myself necessarily an expert in this stuff, except for the fact that I've just given my own personal life experience. I would say, again, there's someone. This has been said many times, but it's like, okay, well, let's just start with doing one thing that scares you. Okay, so what I actually did, I think about the first step I took. Um, I was in actually Victoria, BC, for a wedding, and when I used to travel, I used to take my guitar everywhere because I'd play it. And back then, I was dating a woman who I ended up marrying eventually, and we didn't. There was a long period between us dating back then and us getting married. We're married today, but it was my wife Larice who I was dating back then, and we're in Victoria, and she looked up in the newspaper and saw that there was an open mic, and she's like, "Go play that open." And for me, I'd been in a band in Toronto, so I played in front of thousands of people, but it was always in a band. I'd never ever been on stage alone, and I'd never ever been on stage alone and played one of my songs. So that idea of going to this bar and sitting on stage alone, playing guitar, which I don't really have a lot of confidence in my guitar playing, and singing a song and most of my songs are pretty emotional. So I'm just like, so anyway, she kind of gave me that nudge. We went there, and it was such a crazy experience because I played 3 songs. 2 of them were originals, and one of them was really like emotional. And this bar was like it was like a pub, and there were these bikers, and these guys came up to me that if you had saw these guys, you would have thought, okay, they're like Metallica fans or ACDC fans, right? And the songs I played, and I love both those bands, but the songs I were playing was more like, you know, crowded house, acoustic, folk rock, right? These 2 guys come up to me and they go, "Man, those are really beautiful. That last song really struck a chord with me." And I'm thinking, what? Like it was so weird, right? But that was the first moment of that gave me just a little bit of confidence, right? Of like, oh my God, I did it. A, I didn't die, right? And B, someone actually liked it, and I just made a difference to someone's life. And so then I started buskering because I thought that's a good thing. I'll just go play on the street, and it scared the frickin' heck out of me. And then in the process of buskering, I started making my record, and so it's those little steps. So I mean, my advice would be, okay, well, let's break down what you're afraid of, and let's just take a little step. Like what's one thing you can do that scares you, and let's just see if you survive. And it again goes back a little bit to that happiness is progress quote by Tony Robbins, because I do think when you do something like that, you also are like, I feel better about me. And so that would be my advice, would just be, no matter how small it might seem, what's one little thing you can do that you're scared of?
And what a cool parallel from playing your song for the first time on stage now to the podcast that you're doing today, getting the response that you're getting. Like it's really cool to see. Like if you didn't take that first step to put yourself out there then, you'd never have the opportunity to put yourself out there now the way that you are.
No, I mean, no, of course not at all. Yeah. And it's really scary now because now we're in the internet age. Like I realize we're just getting started, and the response so far has been amazing. I'm really humbled, and I'm like touched and all this stuff. But if this show does well, I realize it's the internet. There's gonna be people out there that hate it, and there's gonna be people out there that hate it that are gonna tell me about it. And I'm a sensitive guy, so I'm already preparing myself for the like, who does this guy think he is? What a jack, and I know that's probably coming because that's the world we live in. But again, I'm okay with that. Whereas I think 15 years ago, I might have been like, I don't want to deal with that. Or I would have thought I was okay with it. And the first time it happened, I would have stopped, and again, like I've learned from so many people over the years, and I often quote other concepts, ideas. Someone said to me once, and I'm sure it's a quote, and someone out there knows the quote, but it's like, if people aren't shooting arrows at you, you're not far enough out on the limb. And we're not going to do anything in our life that probably makes a difference in any significant way if it's not something that's also going to be likely disliked by other people, and whether that means they don't really like it, or they're jealous, or it's not their cup of tea, or whatever, that's just the reality. So I think that not only am I willing to do it, but I'm also like, okay, I'm okay with that, which is something I was not okay with before.
And it's a great show. It's actually my favorite show right now. The first episode that I heard was episode 4, which you've mentioned a couple times during this
Yeah.
interview, about the meaning of life. And the storytelling is excellent. The production is excellent. I love it. And as soon as I heard it, I said, I've got to talk to this guy. I need to, I need to get him on my show before he's too busy.
Well, Mike, I have to tell you, that means, like, really just means so much to me and to Nick. It's funny. Nick's behind the scenes. No one hears him. No one sees him. But there is not a more humble, loyal, great guy than my partner Nick, and he just, as well, is just, this stuff means so much to us, and we appreciate it, and we also take it as a responsibility to keep the bar high and to keep doing what we're doing. So thanks for that.
What's the plan here for the rest of the year? Like what's the vision for the podcast, or is it just one step at a time right now?
Um, a little bit of both. I mean, I think we're a weekly show, so step one of the vision is to put out however many weeks are left in this year, a show every week, and make them be great. Right now, and again, I don't know when this is airing, but if you listen to episode 6, which is the next episode coming out, you're going to hear some of the story, and you might be surprised at some of the story of how this came together. And actually, a little teaser that Nick, who I met in November, who lived in St. Louis, is actually currently living in my house in San Francisco. So he's now squatting in my home. And we're at some point we would love to find a way to monetize it solely from the standpoint of being able to keep doing it. And so what's that going to look like? I don't know. If we get lucky and the audience grows really fast, maybe we can get some ads. We've had conversations about things like Patreon, and getting. I mean, I'm a huge Radiolab listener, and I donate to Radiolab every year, and I've been doing that for 8 years. So the idea of giving to shows that I love, and we're talking about different things we can create, right? Community wise, we're both really big in community. What can we create around? I want to have a community around Where There's Smoke. I really want to build an interactive community where people are, connecting with us and giving us ideas. And I'm going to create like forums online where people can be talking to each other. And, so in doing all that, how do we at least monetize it to the point where it can pay for itself, and how do we create something really cool that people love? And so for now, it's just about creating a great show, and yeah, I don't know, we'll see.
And this is an evolution of your coaching message, which you've been putting out for a while. Is this something that you're doing like in parallel with your coaching work, or is this
Well,
a
I would
completely new
say, I
thing?
mean, as far as yes, I mean, so everything that I do. So for those, we haven't really talked too much about my background, but I'm a professional speaker, a professional trainer, and a coach. Right now, for the last 5 years, a lot of the work I've been doing has actually been with Fortune 1000 companies, working with executive teams and management teams, groups of 12 to 18 people, helping them with emotional intelligence and leadership. I've been involved. In self development and kind of more personal, really, really deep work. I did that for 5 years before I started working with corporations. My kind of tagline for myself, I guess, is that I'm about leadership, lifestyle, and legacy. So I'm about leadership, meaning how are you showing up? Are you showing up as a leader you want to be and making the difference you want to make in your life? As a father, as a husband, as a wife, as a mother, as a manager, as a boss, as an entrepreneur, whatever. Lifestyle, I've always been a lifestyle guy. I just think that, like, what's the life you want to live, and build a business around the lifestyle you want to live. Don't build a lifestyle around your business. And that's something I'm really passionate about. And, I live in America right now where people have a hard time with that, because we live in a world where they think 2 to 3 weeks vacation is enough. And I just don't think that we're all here to work. I think we're here to do something more than that. And then legacy is, not important to everyone necessarily, but it is to me, which is, what are you going to leave behind? And I think I used to think that was about what I'm going to leave behind. Like maybe I'll write a book or this or that. But now I have a son. So now I realize legacy is really about what am I teaching him? And someday when I'm gone, what will be one or two things that he lives his life by because he learned them from me, just like I learned things from my dad. So everything that I do is formulated around this leadership, lifestyle, legacy message. I've got a new website that will be launching in March. And that's going to allow people to understand a little bit more about what I do as far as a speaker and keynotes and I coach really selectively, to be honest with you. I do it, but I never coach more than 4 or 5 people at one time because it's very time consuming, and B, I do like to just work with a handful of people so I can really focus on them. But I really consider the core of what I do is really in speaking and being able to speak to larger groups, and that's why the podcast has been really, really incredible. So yeah, it's all linked. It's all linked, and I also think that is still a work in progress. As far as what is it going to look like come 6 months from now, as far as who I am and how I'm showing up in the world. But it's all the pieces are there.
Yeah. Any sports that you're in? You like?
Oh yeah,
What are your
yeah. I'm a
What are your
sports.
hobbies? There?
I'm yeah, yeah. No, well, I've been a soccer player all my life. So
Cool.
I was a pretty high level soccer player when I was younger. I still play rec, but I'm definitely not quite as skilled as I was when I was younger. I'm a sports fan, and if you've listened to the show, I'm sure you get people get a feel for that. A couple of the episodes have had some sports feel in them, and the tagline of the show is self-development through the lens of current events, sports, and pop culture. So I look at the world out there and kind of use it as a launching pad. So I'm a huge football fan as far as watching football. The Super Bowl was incredible. I'm a huge Toronto Raptors fan. My hometown is Toronto, and Toronto Raptors are an NBA team. So yeah, I love sports, and there's other things I like to do. But honestly, these days, if I'm not working on the podcast or helping people or working with businesses or watching sports, I'm playing with my son. I've got a 3-year-old son. His name is Radic, short form Rad, and he is rad. And so, yeah, for people out there who have kids, I'm sure they understand. It's kind of like your kid becomes your new hobby. And when I'm hanging out with him, we're doing all kinds of things. So, but yeah, if I'm not doing other stuff, I'm always making time to play with him.
Awesome. So what's your as we're winding down here a little bit? What is your like personally? What's your like favorite topic? Like what is it that just really drives you right now that you love talking to people about? You read about it. You can't get enough. What's the thing that's on your mind these days?
Well, interestingly, I think it ends up being, especially with this show, I've always kind of been like this. One of the things that people who know me say is, God, you know a little bit about everything. It feels like you know about everything. And even, when I went to college, I was a theater major and a music minor, but I took classes in everything. So I could go to a cocktail party and I could talk to someone about the science of flight for 5 minutes and then walk away and they'd be like, God, that guy knew a lot. But the reality was I told them everything I knew, right? So I think now with the show, I become really engulfed in whatever I'm working on. So like this week's episode is a lot about storytelling and identity and cognitive psychology and who are we and how do we think about ourselves. So right now that's been really big on my mind. So I think it's kind of, but I mean, I guess if I was to put an underlying theme on everything, I'm really intrigued about why we do the things we do. Because and that's just, I guess you could call it human psychology, whatever you want to call it. But I've always just really been intrigued by the fact that we've got this conscious brain and subconscious brain, and sometimes we're doing things on autopilot, and sometimes we're doing things consciously. And like we talked about earlier, it's like, why do we do the things we do? Why when this is happening am I so emotionally wrecked about it? And why sometimes do I work through it and other times I quit? Like, I'm just really intrigued by it's almost like I'm spent my whole life trying to figure out how the VCR works, but the VCR is human beings, and I just want to know how we work. And I find it really interesting. So that's the overarching thing. And within that, I'm always looking into some topic or another.
Yeah, very cool. I think I'm right there with you on that. I really like that. That's cool. So any closing thoughts here? Anything we didn't get to that you want to get out?
Man, we got to a lot.
I
It's
know.
funny, like an hour. I mean, almost an hour. It's a long time to chat, and yeah. Hopefully, I didn't give away too much here. I'm gonna have nothing left for the podcast.
I'm really looking forward to the rest of the year listening to the podcast, and man, I can't wait to see what's in your future. I love it.
Right on. Well, Mike, again, I really appreciate this. It's been really fun, and you've been a great host. And thanks for having me, man. I'm flattered, and I'm honored to have been able to do it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, bro. I'm so glad you were able to make it. Can you hang around for just a second while I sign off here?
Absolutely.
All right, here we go. So once again, so blown away by the powerful content that we get out of these interviews. If you are in this situation, if you want to feel successful and happy and fulfilled and you just don't have it right now, don't give up. Keep moving forward. It's part of the process. You'll get to where you want to be. Just keep trying to get there. So until we talk again, be the person you want to be, build the business you want to build, and have the successful life you want to have.